The hall was grand, filled with people from different parts of the world. Flags from many nations stood tall behind the long stage where world leaders and intellectuals sat together. Bright lights from the cameras lit up the room, and a steady hum of whispers filled the air. Everyone knew this was not just another conference, it was a gathering where words could shape opinions, and speeches could be remembered for years. The energy was high, and all eyes were fixed on the podium. When Kamala Harris stepped forward, there was an immediate hush. She carried herself with confidence, and her voice was calm yet firm. She began her speech by talking about the history of freedom in her country, a history she said had inspired movements across the world. "We teach freedom," she declared, her words echoing in the large hall. Her statement was bold, and it carried the weight of pride. She spoke about democracy, human rights, and the role of America in helping other nations learn what it meant to be free. Applause broke out at several moments during her speech, especially from those who admired her presence and believed in the values she spoke of. Yet, while the hall was full of clapping hands, not everyone felt convinced. Among the audience was Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. He sat quietly, his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the stage. His face gave away little, but his thoughts were deep. To him, Harris's words sounded powerful, but they also carried a certain sharpness. He thought about his own country and about Africa as a whole, about the years of struggle, the sacrifices of leaders, and the dreams of people who had longed for independence. The idea of someone claiming to teach freedom felt heavy to him, as though the struggles of his people were being overlooked or reduced to lessons in a classroom. As Harris continued, she spoke about partnerships and progress, about nations working together, and about the challenges that the modern world faced. Her speech painted a picture of strength and leadership, where her country stood as a guide to others. For some, it was inspiring. For Traoré, it was a reminder of how often history had been told from only one side. He thought about the times when help from powerful nations had come with conditions, when promises of support had been tied to demands, and when the real meaning of freedom was lost in politics. The young leader looked around the hall. He noticed others sitting silently, their expressions unreadable. Some nodded in agreement with Harris's words, while others shifted in their seats, perhaps thinking the same as he did but unwilling to say it aloud. There was a kind of unspoken tension in the room, as if the speech had touched a nerve that no one wanted to expose too quickly. Harris ended her speech with a strong conclusion, her voice ringing with certainty. She spoke of America's commitment to democracy and justice, of its role in guiding nations toward freedom, and of the importance of standing united. The applause that followed was loud and long. Cameras zoomed in to capture smiling faces and clapping hands, and the moment felt almost like a celebration. Harris returned to her seat with grace, acknowledging the admiration directed toward her. But while the room filled with praise, Traoré remained thoughtful. His silence was not out of disagreement alone but out of respect for the moment. He knew the weight of words, and he understood the importance of timing. There would be a chance for him to speak, and he wanted his words to matter, not just to be heard. As he sat there, he thought of his country's history. He thought of the elders who had fought for independence, the farmers who had worked their land with dignity, and the young people who dreamed of a future where Africa would not need to be taught freedom by anyone. Every memory and thought came back to one truth for him: freedom was not a gift handed over by one nation to another. Freedom was earned, often through pain and sacrifice, and it belonged to those who lived it. To hear it described as something to be taught felt incomplete. It was as if centuries of struggle were being overlooked in a single sentence. As the session moved forward, other speakers gave their remarks. Some praised Harris's words, reinforcing her points and adding their own. Others spoke cautiously, careful not to challenge too much, perhaps aware of the influence her country held. Traoré listened carefully to each one, his mind shaping the words he knew he would soon deliver. He wanted to speak with honesty, but also with clarity and dignity. The audience, unaware of what was to come, continued to listen, clap, and take notes. Outside the hall, reporters were already preparing headlines. Harris's line, "We teach freedom," was being written and typed into articles that would spread across the world. Social media was buzzing, clips of her speech already making their way online, gathering praise from supporters and sparking debates among critics. Inside the hall, however, the mood was more complex. People exchanged glances, some questioning, some approving. The applause had died down, but the weight of her words lingered in the air. It was in that quiet space that Traoré's determination grew. He knew that when he spoke, he would not only be responding to Harris, but also to the many unspoken feelings in the room. For now, though, he waited. His time would come. The world had heard one version of freedom, spoken with power and confidence. Soon, it would hear another, one shaped by experience, struggle, and a very different truth. And in that moment of silence, as he sat among leaders and thinkers, Traoré prepared himself to speak not only for his country but for many others who felt the same. Ibrahim Traoré sat quietly in the large hall, the echo of Kamala Harris's words still circling in his mind. The applause had ended, and now other speakers had begun to share their points, but his thoughts were far away. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, yet inside him memories and reflections stirred. For him, freedom was not a subject for speeches alone, it was something he had seen his people fight for, something that lived in the soil of his land and in the stories of those who had come before him. Every line Harris had spoken reminded him of the differences between words spoken in comfort and lives lived in struggle. She had said, "We teach freedom," and the hall had filled with admiration. But to him, those words felt incomplete, almost distant from the truth he knew. He remembered his childhood in Burkina Faso, growing up in a modest home where his parents worked hard to provide. His mother would often remind him that dignity was more valuable than wealth, and his father would tell him stories of their country's heroes, men and women who had stood against colonial powers, who had fought not for recognition but for the right to live freely on their own land. These stories had shaped him, teaching him that freedom was not given, but earned. As he sat in the hall, surrounded by polished suits and international leaders, those early lessons came back to him. He thought of his ancestors who had tilled the fields under the burning sun, their sweat watering the soil that fed their families. He thought of the leaders who had resisted foreign control, who had dreamed of a future where Africa could stand tall without needing to be guided like a child. To him, freedom had always been tied to sacrifice, to endurance, and to the belief that one's destiny should never be written by someone else. The more he reflected, the clearer it became why Harris's words felt heavy. Teaching freedom sounded like a gift being offered, but he knew it was not something that could be handed over. True freedom was not a lesson to be memorized, it was a spirit that grew out of pain, resistance, and resilience. It was not about learning from another nation, it was about living it, day after day, even when the odds were against you. Traoré shifted slightly in his chair, his mind deep in thought. He looked around the hall. Some leaders nodded politely at the speeches being delivered. Others scribbled notes, careful to capture the polished phrases they could later repeat in their own statements. But he noticed something else, two faces in the crowd that looked thoughtful, perhaps unsettled. He was not alone in his feelings, he could sense it. For him, this was not just about pride. It was about honesty. He knew the importance of words spoken in such gatherings. A single line could travel across borders, spark debates, or inspire movements. If no one responded to Harris's claim, the world might believe it without question. But he also understood the weight of speaking. To challenge such a bold statement meant exposing truths that some people preferred to ignore. It meant reminding the world that freedom had not always been evenly shared, and that many nations had paid a price for others' power. As he thought about it, he remembered the times his own country had struggled. He remembered the droughts that had tested the strength of farmers, the shortages that had forced families to go without, and the promises of aid that had often come with hidden conditions. He remembered how often foreign voices had spoken of helping Africa, but how rarely they had listened to Africa's own voice. Those memories pressed on him, reminding him that his reply, when it came, could not just be about himself. It had to speak for many. He closed his eyes briefly, as if collecting his thoughts. He did not feel anger. Anger would only cloud the message. What he felt was clarity. He wanted to make it known that freedom was not something his people needed to be taught. They had lived it, struggled for it, and carried it in their hearts. What they needed was respect, not lessons. The sound of applause broke into his thoughts again as another speaker finished. The moderator thanked them and moved on to the next. The hall seemed restless now, people shifting in their seats, some glancing at the young leader from Burkina Faso. His reputation as a strong, honest speaker had already grown beyond his borders. Many wondered if he would respond. Some hoped he would stay silent, while others quietly wished he would speak. Traoré remained calm. He knew the moment to speak would arrive soon, and when it did, he would not waste it. He thought again of Harris's words. He thought of the children in his country, walking to school with hope in their eyes. He thought of the farmers who bent over their land, planting seeds not just of crops but of survival and future. He thought of the elders who carried memories of harder times, who reminded the young that freedom came at a cost. These were the people he wanted to represent in his reply. He also thought of the wider world, the journalists who would write about the event, the young people across Africa who would watch the videos online, the ordinary men and women who were tired of being told their lives had to be shaped by others. His words would not just echo in the hall, they would travel far. He wanted them to carry dignity, truth, and courage. The hall continued with its program, but for Traoré time felt different. His thoughts were layered, full of history and responsibility. He thought about how silence could sometimes be mistaken for agreement. If no one responded, the idea that one nation could claim to teach freedom would stand unchallenged. He knew he could not allow that. So, he sat quietly, reflecting deeply. His reply was already forming in his mind, sentence by sentence, shaped by the lessons of his past and the hopes of his people. He would not speak with anger, nor with pride for himself, but with conviction for something larger. For him, this was not just about a debate in a conference hall. It was about reminding the world that freedom was not a gift, it was a truth, carried in the hearts of those who refused to be bound. And as he waited for his turn, he knew the words he would speak would not only challenge Harris's claim, but would also awaken something in those who listened. The time for polite silence was ending. The time for truth was coming. The hall had grown quieter as the session continued. Leaders and speakers had taken their turns, some echoing Kamala Harris's words, others adding cautious agreements of their own. The applause had been steady, but not as strong as before. People were listening carefully now, as if waiting for something more. Ibrahim Traoré sat among them, his face calm but his mind alive with thoughts. He had been listening to every word, weighing the tone of each speech. The voices around him spoke of partnership, progress, and lessons learned. But no one had dared to question the bold claim that had started it all: we teach freedom. He knew the moment was coming when he would have to stand and speak. When the moderator finally called on him, the room shifted. Heads turned toward him, cameras zoomed in, and an expectant silence spread through the audience. Traoré rose from his seat slowly, his posture tall and steady. He carried himself with quiet strength, not rushing, not fidgeting, but moving with the ease of someone who knew the weight of his words before he spoke them. He reached the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and let his eyes sweep across the hall. He did not begin immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to linger for a moment. It was a silence that drew people in, made them lean forward, made them pay attention. Then, in a calm, steady voice, he began. I listened carefully, he said, to the words spoken here today. I heard about freedom, about democracy, about lessons that one nation claims to teach the rest of the world. His voice was not raised, but it carried. Every word was clear, each syllable chosen with care. But freedom, he continued, is not a subject for a classroom. It is not a lesson given from one people to another. Freedom is lived, freedom is earned, freedom is fought for. And those who claim to teach it often forget to live it themselves. The hall was still. The weight of his words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through the crowd. Some faces stiffened, others softened. A few people looked down, scribbling notes furiously. The cameras stayed fixed on him, capturing every detail, every shift in his expression. He did not stop there. He spoke of the history of his people, of how they had struggled under foreign control, how they had risen to claim their independence, how they had carried the cost of freedom in their own bodies and lives. No one taught us this, he said, his voice steady. It was not given in a book, not handed to us in a speech. It was carved into our land, written in our blood, carried in our hearts. As he spoke, his words seemed to build a rhythm. The more he spoke, the more people listened. It was not the force of anger that held them, it was the power of truth told plainly. His tone was not aggressive, but firm, filled with conviction. He reminded the audience that freedom was not a product to be exported, not a lesson to be passed from one nation to another as if it were a charity. Those who speak of teaching freedom, he said, pausing slightly, must first ask themselves, have they learned it fully themselves? Because true freedom means respect for others. True freedom means listening as much as speaking. True freedom means letting others live without control or interference. His words were like a mirror, reflecting back the contradictions that many had chosen to ignore. The hall remained silent, but it was not the silence of disinterest, it was the silence of people absorbing something they had not expected to hear. He then shared his reflections on the modern world. He spoke of nations still struggling under unfair systems, of resources taken without justice, of communities that were left behind while others grew richer. He did not point fingers directly, but his meaning was clear. He was not only speaking for Burkina Faso, but for many nations that had felt the same pressures, the same struggles. Then came the line that would echo far beyond the walls of the hall. He leaned slightly toward the microphone, his voice steady, his expression calm. You speak of teaching freedom, he said. But you still have not learned freedom yourselves. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and sharp. For a moment, the hall was frozen. The audience sat in silence, eyes wide, breaths caught. Then, slowly, the reaction spread. Some people gasped softly, others whispered to their neighbors. A few clapped hesitantly, then more joined, until the sound of applause began to grow, mixing with murmurs of shock and respect. Traoré did not smile, nor did he show anger. He simply stood tall, letting the reaction wash over the room. His words were not meant to provoke for the sake of provocation, they were meant to remind, to awaken, to tell a truth that needed to be heard. He stepped back from the microphone slightly, his message delivered, his presence firm. The moderator, caught off guard, cleared their throat and tried to bring the session back to order. The hall, however, was not the same. The air felt different, charged with the weight of what had just been said. Harris sat calmly, her face controlled, but her eyes thoughtful. She had heard many responses in her career, but this one was different. It was not just a disagreement, it was a statement of principle, a challenge to think more deeply about what freedom truly meant. Traoré returned to his seat, moving with the same steady calmness with which he had risen. Around him, whispers continued. Some looked at him with admiration, others with disapproval, but no one could ignore him. His words had struck a chord that could not be easily forgotten. In that moment, the hall had witnessed something rare. It was not just a speech, it was an exchange that would be remembered, discussed, and debated long after the conference ended. One bold claim had been made, and one bold reply had answered it. Both now belonged to history. And as he sat quietly again, Ibrahim Traoré knew his role was done. He had spoken not just for himself, not just for his country, but for many who had carried the same feelings silently. His words had broken that silence. Now, the world would have to decide how to respond. The room was still buzzing from Ibrahim Traoré's sharp reply. His words had landed with the weight of truth, and though he spoke calmly, the message was unforgettable. Leaders whispered to one another in low voices, reporters quickly typed notes, and cameras caught every movement on stage. The atmosphere had shifted. What began as a polished series of speeches had now turned into a moment of real confrontation, the kind that history remembers. Traoré remained seated, composed, not reacting to the stir around him. His job was not to argue endlessly but to plant a seed of thought, and that seed had already been planted. Across the hall, people were still processing his statement, "You still have not learned freedom yourselves." It echoed in minds, challenging assumptions and forcing reflection. Some delegates clapped politely, unsure of how strongly to show their approval. Others frowned, their expressions tight, as if offended by the boldness of his words. But among the younger audience, among activists, journalists, and observers, there was a different reaction. Many of them felt a spark of pride, a sense that someone had spoken the truth openly, without fear, in a place where so many preferred safe phrases and polished statements. The moderator struggled to steady the moment, offering thanks to Traoré and attempting to move forward with the schedule. But the energy in the room was restless. The next speaker hesitated, aware that following such a reply was no easy task. Words that might have sounded strong before now felt hollow in comparison. Traoré, however, did not seek to dominate the stage. He had said what needed to be said, and now he watched quietly, his thoughts turning inward. He remembered his country, his people, and the many sacrifices that had been made for dignity. He had not spoken for applause, but for them. As the program continued, reactions slowly unfolded. Some leaders leaned toward Harris, whispering their thoughts. Others scribbled in their notebooks, perhaps planning how to respond later in interviews. Harris herself sat with her usual composure, her face calm, her body language controlled. But behind her steady expression, her mind was turning. She was experienced enough to know when words carried weight, and she knew Traoré's reply had power. Reporters in the back of the hall were already sending out quick summaries. "Young African leader challenges Harris," one typed. "Sharp reply at International Forum," wrote another. News agencies competed to capture the story first, knowing it would make headlines. On social media, clips of Traoré's statement were already spreading, sparking debates in real time. Some users praised his courage, while others criticized him for daring to confront a powerful figure. Inside the hall, though, the tension lingered. The stinging honesty of his words was not something that could be brushed aside easily. It was a reminder that not everyone saw the world through the same lens, that different histories shaped different truths. Harris had spoken with pride about America's role in teaching freedom. Traoré had answered with a reminder that freedom was not a lesson to export, but a principle to embody. As the day went on, the conversations in the corridors reflected this divide. Some delegates whispered that Traoré had been too bold, that such words might close doors instead of opening them. Others argued that he had only said what many were already thinking but did not have the courage to say aloud. In hushed voices, people admitted that his speech had stirred something that official statements often lacked: honesty. In the press room, questions were being prepared. Journalists wanted to know how Harris would respond, whether she would address his comments directly or let them pass quietly. They wanted to know what Traoré would say if asked again. They wanted to know how this exchange would affect future meetings and partnerships. It was no longer just a speech, it had become a story that touched politics, history, and pride. Meanwhile, Traoré continued to carry himself with calmness. When people approached him, he listened with patience. Some congratulated him, others challenged him, but he did not show arrogance or irritation. He answered simply, reminding them that he had spoken not for himself but for his people, for those who had endured the cost of freedom. He knew his words would cause reactions: support, criticism, even misunderstanding. But he also knew that silence would have been worse. Silence would have allowed the idea of teaching freedom to stand unchallenged, as if the struggles of his people and others like them did not matter. His reply was not meant to divide, but to remind. Back on stage, other leaders tried to steer the focus back to cooperation and unity. They spoke of building bridges, of working together for global peace. Their words were important, but the hall still carried the memory of Traoré's voice. No matter what followed, that one reply had shifted the tone. For those watching from afar, the image of a young African leader standing with such firmness against a powerful figure became a symbol. In villages and cities across his continent, people replayed his words with pride. They saw in him not just a leader of a country, but a representative of their shared dignity. In other parts of the world, too, his words sparked reflection. Some agreed with him, realizing that freedom was often spoken of but not always lived. Others disagreed, insisting that his challenge had been unnecessary. But no matter the opinion, one truth was clear: his words could not be ignored. As the session ended and delegates left the hall, the story was already bigger than the event itself. Reporters followed Harris, eager for her response. Cameras flashed as she smiled politely, offering short, careful comments that acknowledged the diversity of views. She chose not to clash further, but to remain diplomatic, as leaders often do in public. Traoré, too, was surrounded, but his approach was different. He spoke with young reporters who asked him what he meant. He explained gently that freedom was not something that could be handed down from one nation to another. It was something each people had to claim for themselves. His words were not crafted for diplomacy, they were spoken plainly, in the same way he had addressed the hall. That night, headlines across the world carried the story. Some called it a clash, others called it a dialogue. But everyone agreed it was unforgettable. The phrase "you still have not learned freedom yourselves" appeared in bold letters across newspapers, online articles, and social feeds. In homes across Africa, families talked about it. Some smiled proudly, others debated what it meant, but all felt the weight of hearing their struggles acknowledged in such a bold way. In universities, students replayed the speech and discussed its meaning. In political offices, leaders considered what it meant for future negotiations. And in the heart of it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained calm. He did not boast about what he had said, nor did he seek to stir further conflict. He had spoken his truth, and that was enough. For him, the most important thing was not how the world reacted in the moment, but how the message would echo in the future. Freedom, he believed, could not be reduced to words on a stage. It was lived in every struggle, in every act of dignity, in every refusal to bow down to control. He had spoken to remind the world of that, and he trusted that his words, carried on by those who heard them, would keep that truth alive. News of the exchange spread across the world almost instantly. By the time the conference ended and leaders stepped out of the hall, articles had already been published online, and short clips of Ibrahim Traoré's reply were circulating on every major platform. The phrase "you still have not learned freedom yourselves" had become the headline of the day. It was repeated in different languages, debated on television, and quoted in thousands of posts across social media. In many places, people saw his words as a breath of fresh air. For too long, leaders in such international gatherings had chosen polite language that avoided direct challenges. But Traoré's reply was different. He had spoken without fear, with dignity, and with clarity. His message had cut through the polished atmosphere of the conference and reached people's hearts. In African cities and villages, his name was spoken with pride. Young people especially admired the way he stood tall and reminded the world that Africa's voice could not be dismissed. At the same time, reactions elsewhere were mixed. Some commentators praised his courage, saying it was time someone reminded powerful nations that freedom was not theirs alone to define. Others criticized him, calling his reply too harsh, too bold, or even disrespectful. But regardless of opinion, no one could ignore the moment. The fact that the youngest leader in the hall had spoken so directly to one of the most powerful figures in the world made the story even more striking. Inside his own country, the impact was immediate. Newspapers in Burkina Faso printed his words in large letters across their front pages. Radio hosts replayed his speech throughout the day, and callers expressed their feelings with passion and excitement. Many said they felt seen, that for once their struggles and history had been spoken of honestly in a place where it truly mattered. For the people, it was not only about politics, it was about dignity. Traoré himself remained calm, even as the world reacted around him. To those close to him, he said little more than this: he had only spoken the truth as he saw it. He reminded them that speeches come and go, but truth remains. He did not seek fame, nor did he chase applause. He knew well that praise could quickly turn into criticism, but what mattered to him was that the message had been delivered. For Harris, the moment was also significant. Though her expression during the exchange had remained composed, she too understood the weight of his reply. Later, in interviews, she chose her words carefully. She acknowledged that freedom was indeed complex, that every nation had its own journey, and that there was always more to learn. She did not try to erase or diminish his words, but rather to show balance. Her experience as a leader allowed her to remain steady, but it was clear that Traoré's challenge had left an impression even on her. In the following days, global media continued to analyze the exchange. Experts appeared on television to discuss what it meant for international relations. Some saw it as a sign of a changing world, where younger leaders from smaller nations were no longer willing to remain silent in front of powerful countries. Others argued it was simply a bold moment that would soon be forgotten. Yet, with every replay of the clip, with every article that spread online, the weight of Traoré's words seemed to grow, not fade. Students in universities across Africa debated the speech in classrooms. Many of them said it inspired them to believe that their voices, too, could be heard. They discussed how freedom was not only about politics but also about education, about opportunities, about living with dignity. His words became part of conversations that stretched far beyond the walls of the conference hall. In other parts of the world, people also reflected. Some began to question their own definitions of freedom. Was it enough to speak about it in speeches, or did it require deeper action? Was it enough to promote it abroad while still struggling with issues at home? These questions, stirred by his reply, lingered in minds across nations. For Traoré, the aftermath was not about victory or defeat. He continued his duties as a leader, focusing on the needs of his people. When asked about the exchange, he answered humbly, reminding journalists that his country's struggles were not unique, and that many others had faced the same. He insisted that freedom could not be owned by any single nation, and that to live it meant respecting others' rights to define it for themselves. What made the moment unforgettable was not only the words themselves but also the way they were spoken. He had not raised his voice, he had not shown anger, and he had not sought to embarrass anyone. Instead, he had spoken plainly, directly, and truthfully. That simplicity was what gave his reply its strength. It was not an attack, it was a reminder. As time passed, the exchange remained a reference point. Whenever discussions about global leadership and fairness arose, people recalled that day, that hall, and those words. It became a symbol of the need for honesty in places where diplomacy often covered truth. In his own heart, Traoré carried no pride from the moment. He saw it simply as his duty to speak for those who had no microphone, for those whose voices were too often overlooked. He remembered the farmers who worked under the hot sun, the children who dreamed of better schools, the elders who carried memories of past struggles. It was for them that he had spoken, and it was their dignity he had defended. Freedom, to him, would always be more than speeches. It would be the right of every child to learn, the right of every family to eat from their land, the right of every nation to stand tall without being told they must be guided. And though debates would continue, though critics would speak, he knew his message had already reached where it needed to go, the hearts of ordinary people who understood what freedom truly meant. In the end, the hall returned to quiet, the leaders moved on to other issues, and the world turned to new stories. But that single exchange remained etched in memory. One voice had claimed to teach freedom, and another had reminded the world that freedom was not a lesson but a way of life. Between the applause, the silence, and the headlines, a truth had been spoken that could not be taken back. And long after the lights dimmed, long after the reporters packed their cameras, and long after the leaders left the stage, the words continued to live on. They traveled across borders, carried by those who believed in them, whispered in homes and classrooms, repeated in debates and articles. They became more than a reply, they became a reminder to the world that freedom is not taught, not borrowed, not owned. It is lived.